This is Keys to the Shop, episode 443, The Power of Simple Communication with Ben Guttmann. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I am your host for the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. Don't forget to subscribe to Keys to the Shop. All you have to do is hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast and download the episodes, and you will be updated every time new episodes come out, which is quite often, and great content that will help you build a great business and career and help you find fulfillment in the coffee shop space. And also, it'd be great if you would leave a 5-star rating or review over on Apple Podcasts and share these episodes when you have the opportunity to do so, especially on social media. Helps more people find this show. You know, there's so many people who could benefit from the catalog of topics and interviews that Keys to the Shop has over these 7 years. And I really would love if you would help Keys to the Shop get out there to the specialty coffee retail community. So thank you very much, everybody. Now, I want to let you know that on top of doing this podcast, Keys to the Shop is also a consulting company. So Keys to the Shop Consulting is where I get to work one-on-one with entrepreneurs and operators to help them run a thriving coffee shop through pursuing excellence in their operations, their people, and their quality, as well as helping them get started on the right foot if you're just starting in the coffee space. I've been working with lots of people over the last couple of years, and maybe this is the right fit for you. If you're interested in one-on-one consulting with myself at Keys to the Shop Consulting, email chris@keystotheshop.com. And also, if you want to get on an early access list for the applications for our mastermind group, this is a coaching group of fellow entrepreneurs and coffee shop owners that is so dynamic and awesome. And everyone in the group helps each other with accountability, insights, and encouragement on a bi-weekly basis over 6 months, 2 hours each call. Each person gets a ton of focused time on their particular business and the topics that are really important for them to get insight on. It's a wonderful experience, and if you want to be considered to be part of one of these groups, new groups are launching in March of 2024. Simply email chris@keystotheshop.com and let me know that you're interested. I'll put your name on the list and you'll get early access to apply for these new groups starting in the beginning part of 2024. So one of the things that I love about coffee is, of course, the coffee. And, you know, the idea that I have been in coffee now for 24 years is not lost on me and my, aching joints. But the thing that makes it better is better coffee. And one of the things that makes coffee better is technology that bears in mind that coffee is a dynamic thing. Technology like the ground control brewer that lets you dial in the experience of each origin to the utmost. It's been revolutionizing coffee over the past few years. And the machine itself uses SCA award-winning technology to not only extract incredible depth and range of flavor for batch brew coffee, but it also makes concentrates for iced lattes as well as 8-minute cold brew. And the new brewer that they've just come out with this year is 45% less in terms of investment than the Cyclops brewer when you use early bird special pricing. It is a shorter height, and so it's more compact, but it has a 30% higher volume for batch espresso and cold brew concentrate. And this machine is cloud connected to a smart dispenser that tracks all your brewing data. So the greatest machine for batch brew coffee to come out in a while is actually even better. So check them out at groundcontrol.coffee. Learn more about this amazing piece of equipment. If you're interested in better coffee, more efficiency, more avenues of profitability, then I think you should be looking at getting a ground control over at groundcontrol.coffee. Now, pouring milk into cups and making designs is a simple sounding thing, but actually it is one of the biggest wow factors that we have in specialty coffee. Like it or not, it is actually very fun to do. It's one of the things that I started doing when I got into coffee as my main focus. And I still am, as a head judge for a Coffee Fast Latte Art competition, involved deeply in this. And one of the greatest things is that the options for plant-based beverages include products that actually can make latte art. And the best in the space is the Barista Series. The Barista Series is a line of plant-based performance beverages that was created for baristas that love to pour latte art, baristas that want to serve their customers great tasting things. And so the standing up to the heat from the steaming part Pacific does it. The taste balance and the flavor of the beverage is accounted for in how the drinks are formulated. And also, it creates great texture for your beverages. So you can pour latte art. And the customers love all of these things regarding the Pacific Barista series. So go to pacificfoodservice.com. That's pacificfoodservice.com. Learn more about this, get it in your store, and try it for yourself. I think if you're going to be serving your customers plant-based beverages, you should try to serve them the best. And I think that is the Barista series from Pacific. All right, everybody. Well, today I am excited to welcome to the show author Ben Guttmann, who is a marketing and communications expert and author of the book Simply Put: Why Clear Messages Win and How to Design Them. He is an experienced marketing executive and educator who is on a mission to get leaders to more effectively connect by simplifying their message. And Ben is a former co-founder and managing partner at Digital Natives Group, which is an award-winning agency that works with the NFL, I Love New York, Comcast, NBCUniversal, Hachette Book Group, the Nature Conservancy, and other major clients. And currently, Ben teaches digital marketing at Baruch College in New York City and consults with a range of thought leaders and venture-backed startups and other brands. And this book, Simply Put, is just a treasure of content that is supremely timed, considering the amount of noise that we have in our industry and in the world. And people that look for clarity in the signal in the noise rely on us to cultivate that for them. And so having this conversation with Ben feels very timely for where we are in coffee. And I feel like in this conversation, as we discuss many different points of how we can overcomplicate communication, how we're all marketers, what we can do to constrain ourselves to make our message more simple, to really get people to buy into certain things that we either want them to actually buy or values and ways of working and things like that. There's going to be a lot of things that you can apply to your coffee bar. And Ben does a masterful job in this conversation discussing how he came to this point of realization of simplicity being this powerful tool. We also talk about the science behind making things overly complex, some studies that show the negative effects of the way that we overcomplicate things, and some tactical ways that we can simplify the way we communicate both in our business to our staff and externally to our customers for the benefit of everybody. So without anything else from me, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with the author of the book, Simply Put, Ben Guttmann. All right, Ben, welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and really kind of feeling like this was meant to be, honestly. The idea of simplicity in the way that we deliver our communication, it feels like a tension, even the stuff that we talk about on the show, where we always like people to be detail oriented. We're always talking about the details of work, but then we're like, hey, let's keep it simple. And it's easier said than done, especially in the conversations I've been having at trade shows and on these programs. It feels like this is exactly the right time to talk about this. So thank you for coming on the show and having this conversation. I think maybe a good place to start would be to talk about where in the course of your own career, and tell us a little bit about how this kind of came to be for you as a realization. Where in the course of your career did you really kind of alight upon this idea that simplicity was this asset that you had to use to be successful there, but is also something that I guess everybody needs to be successful?
Oh, definitely. I mean, my background, I ran a marketing agency for 10 years. I started this in my old professor's basement, and we worked with like the local ice cream shop, the local camera shop. And then eventually we got a little bit bigger. We got a little bit more business and more clients and more employees, and we got an office. And eventually, after 10 years, we're working with like the NFL and Comcast and I Love New York and all these really great brands. And it doesn't matter if they were the small business or if they were the biggest titans of industry. Every single time I would sit down with a client, I would see the same struggle about they have something really great. They have a great mission or a great product, and they just can't really connect that between what they're thinking and what they believe and what they know to get that out. And it would come up again and again that, maybe we worked with authors. You have a really wonderful idea, but you're so close to it that you're not able to articulate it in a way that the customer, the client, the reader, the voter, the donor, that they understand. And so that's why you hire a marketing agency, right? Like that's what we would be doing. But once I sold the business about a year ago, year and a half ago, I was able to kind of get that removed and start looking at, well, what really was the problem that we were solving all the time? And it all boiled down to, well, some messaging, some communication would work and would be effective, and others didn't. So, what's the difference? And that's kind of how I arrived at all the stuff we're talking about today with simplicity and the book and everything else.
Right. And the idea is that you want people in marketing, you want them to get the core message so that they can, I imagine, just maybe you have to have trust in that they're going to fill in the blanks, but that there's a distrust that people will fill in the blanks. So we have to just kind of give caveats and give explanations and give detail. I mean, these people that have these brands, they're not stupid, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, they're genius people, but the ineffectiveness of their communication would belie their intelligence. So is it that? What keeps us complicating these things?
So when I looked into it, when I was able to ask that question, which is why do some messages work and others don't? Turned out the answer was simple, right? And if that's enough, then you don't need to read the other 207 pages of the book. But
That's
but
right.
when you realize, well, what does that mean to be simple? And then why is it so hard? And then how do we get there? So let me kind of like dive into the science piece of this here. So we know this word fluency, right? Like we're talking in English, we're fluent in English. You can be fluent in Spanish or Mandarin. You can be fluent in math or chess. There's a lot of different things that you can be fluent in. When we're fluent, things are easy. It comes from the Latin root for the word flowing, actually, right? Which is what it feels like. But if you ask a cognitive scientist about the word fluency, well, that describes how easy is it for you to take something from out in the world, stick in your head, and make sense of it. And it turns out when you look at things that are fluent and things that are not fluent, things that are easy to put in your head and make use of, well, they're associated with all sorts of positive things that you're more likely to like, to trust, and to buy something that is fluent, a message that is fluent, than the other way around. And if something takes a lot of work, if something is really making you sweat, it's hard to see it, hard to understand it, hard to make sense of the language. If it takes that type of effort and it becomes less fluent, well, the opposite's also true. You are less likely to buy, less likely to like, and less likely to trust the message, the communicator that is less fluent. That's the kind of basis for simplicity, actually. It's about how easy is it for you to make sense of something. And so that's where we want to be, right? As a receiver, and so I break this down in the book and I say, well, there's all these different roles we wear, but really it comes down to there's senders and there's receivers. Sender is somebody who's the advertiser, the entrepreneur, the leader. The receiver is anybody who, they're trying to talk to the customer, the buyer, the voter, the donor. So when we're wearing the receiver hat, though, we want things to be simple. We want things to be easy, to be fluent. But when we're senders, we have this really hard job doing that. Internally, we're subject to something known as an additive bias, where we're more likely, when we're asked to improve something or change something or to create something, to add instead of subtract. And then on the outside, the external forces, well, there's all sorts of things that push us to complicate instead of simplify, right? Our boss wants something, we build something instead of remove something, it gets in the media or it gets a line on our LinkedIn or our resume. We're always incentivized to add that extra page, the extra PowerPoint slide, that extra thing on our menu, as opposed to simplifying. So that's the gulf there is between we really want something that is simple, that is fluent, but when we're in charge of sending, when that's our job, we're really not built for that.
Where does that bias come from? Because I can see it in my mind's eye. I go to coffee shops, and there is this idea of how do we get differentiated between us and our competitors? We're going to add like six more syrups. We're going to add different signature beverages, and eventually it just becomes this giant monolith of choice paralysis, right? And it's like one of my favorite episodes of Kitchen Nightmares, where Gordon Ramsay looks at the menu that's like 12 pages long, and it's there is like this comfort for us that there's security in this glut of options. But how does that develop? And is it simply a bias that we're all born with, or is it actually a product of being consumers ourselves, but not really being aware of what's effective from the marketing perspective?
Oh yeah, I think that some of that you just mentioned there. I'm glad you alluded to the paradox of choice, right? So this is some research done by Barry Schwartz. He had a whole book about it a number of years ago, where the more options that there are, the less satisfied, the less happy we are with the option which we choose, right? Because we're no longer giving up just if there's 3 items in your menu and I choose one, I'm giving up the other 2. But if there's 12 items on your menu and I choose one, well, I'm giving up the other 11. And so that actually feels worse as the consumer to have more of those options that are the opportunity costs that I gave away. So that's one piece of it. But you also mentioned there's little evidence of absence, right? We notice things when they're there, when we built that bridge, when we added that thing to the menu, when we added that slide to our presentation. But we don't really get credit for the things that aren't there, right? There's little evidence of absence.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we want credit, I guess.
We want credit. We want proof that our work in a kind of a bigger environment with more kind of stakeholders, corporate places, they want to kind of save our butts, right? In my universe, where I come from, like advertising, marketing, client services, one thing that's important to realize is that oftentimes the result of the work is part of what the client cares about. But really, what they actually care about the most is their ability to justify their own decisions, to justify their own actions. There's an old phrase, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. People want to feel like they're safe in choosing you and that they're safe in their decision making. And that often plays into all of this.
Okay. Here's the idea that I think is a tension for me, and is that we're talking about marketing, okay, but also we're talking about communication when we're leaders, when we're a manager of a coffee shop and we want to communicate something to our staff. We will maybe hedge our words and we'll be very like ultra detailed. And I'm actually a fan of having some place where detail is dictated. However, there seems to be sometimes too many meetings, too many words. We want people to be detail oriented. How do we employ simplicity in our communication in these scenarios where we want people to be detail oriented while at the same time keeping our own communication about that simple?
Well, I say early on in the book, and I say this all the time in my work, is that we're all marketers. Anybody who has something they want to say and wants people to hear it, anybody whose job is to inform or persuade, anybody who's an advocate or a parent or colleague, even not even in a leadership position, everybody's in charge of somehow making change in the world, and the skills of marketing are fundamental to that. The other thing I would say is if there is no quiet, there can be no loud, right? If you go out and you have a meeting every single day and you're going an hour and a half and you're droning on about policies and this and that, well, nothing there is going to stand out. But if you give the space for something to be salient, to be different, well, that's going to end up sticking in people's minds a lot more than just whatever the fifth bullet on your seventh slide on your eighth presentation of the week is.
Okay, so the follow up to that would be, out of all the things that I think are very important to communicate to people, which is the one that's most important, and how do I actually determine the priority there?
Oh, certainly. Right. What one of the tools I talk about when I looked into how we bridge that gap between where we want to be as receivers and where we are as senders. So I've identified 5 different tools there. The first design principle is beneficial. What's in it for them, right? What's in it for the receiver? And this is a little bit harder to see when you're talking about kind of the staff training piece of it, but especially when talking to customers, this is very clear. What's in it for them? People don't want the thing, they want what the thing does for them. There's a sentence that I tell my students every semester, and I tell them, if you remember this, you're going to be so far ahead of everybody else in marketing. Even if it's the only thing you remember from your entire course, your entire degree. And it's not mine, by the way. It's from a 60s marketing professor named Theodore Levitt. He said, people don't want a quarter-inch drill. They want a quarter-inch hole. They don't want the thing, they want what the thing does for them. They don't want the feature, they want the benefit. This is kind of sales 101 type of stuff. So if you look at that framework there where people don't buy features, they buy benefit, and you start to interrogate it a little bit, you can actually go a few levels deeper because there's the functional benefit, the stuff that you see in the world. And then there is the emotional benefit, which if you ask kind of so what from the functional benefit, you get to that. And then eventually you get to the core motivation. So let me give an example. Like minty toothpaste. If my toothpaste is mint flavor, that's the feature. But if I ask, well, so what? Well, what's the benefit of that? Well, mint flavor means that I'm going to have fresh breath. Okay, that's the functional benefit. But I actually don't really want fresh breath. I want something else. So what about that fresh breath? Well, that means I'm going to have a better date tonight. I'll be more successful on my Tinder date, whatever it is. Okay, that's actually a little bit more aligned with what we want. And if you ask, so what again, then you get to that kind of foundational need of saying, well, maybe it's love and belonging, right? Or it's physiological needs even. So you've gone from the feature, the little like the detail that's out in the world, and by interrogating it a few times, you get to this kind of core motivation. And then you take that and you start to ladder it back up and you say, well, okay, and that's the direction I want to go in. And then how do I tie in the emotional benefit? That's the first thing I want to lead with. That's the hook. That's the first slide of my deck. That's the thing I'm leading with in my marketing messaging. And then I get into the functional benefits and then I get into the features. By communicating in that direction, if it's internal or if it's external, you end up being a lot more aligned with how people actually act.
I mean, this all makes perfect sense. And at the same time, we have these days that are just running us. We are putting out fires and our emotions are at a peak. And I find that it's easy to have a real impatience. Oh, and urgency is sort of like the word we might use, but actually it's just impatience with a fancy word, fancy title. I can't imagine going through the exercise that you just talked about in the day to day of work without also exercising some degree of patience and to say, this is actually what I really want to communicate versus I'm just going to fire off a bunch of communication because I'm so freaking like stressed right now. How do we overcome that inertia to actually be a little bit more mindful in the way we develop these things?
That's a good question. This mindset of talking about benefits of these other pieces about being focused, about being salient, empathetic, all of these, I call them design tools because they do take that intentionality. This is something that is much easier to apply when you do have that time to craft that email, to write that training manual, to write the website copy, than it is kind of just off the cuff, right? Because when you're in this extemporaneous circumstance where you're on the fly here, we do fall back to those norms that we talked about. We default to complication. That's really the ultimate challenge here. One thing also that I'll throw out is a tool that can sometimes be useful is to drastically enforce constraints on yourself. So instead of giving yourself 5 minutes to draft that email about this thing, give yourself 30 seconds to draft that email. See what you can get across in just that amount of time. Or instead of saying, hey, I have 100 words that's going to go into this policy. How can you explain that policy in 20 words or 10 words or 5 words? And oftentimes that actually is a lot harder to do less like that, but you're going to end up with something that you start to exercise that muscle a little bit, and it will be something that will be easier later on.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, I have to admit, I didn't expect that's where we would go here because my initial thought is if I only take 30 seconds to draft an email, not only, of course, naturally will I think I'm going to miss something, but I'll misstate something. And to me, like adding more time to the equation means I can craft something more deliberately and with a lot of fussing and things. But it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe the constraint element is something that we have to self impose.
Oh, yeah. And actually, constraints can work in both directions, right? So you can constrain yourself by saying, I have to get this thing done in this short period of time, or I only have 10 words to work with on something. But constraints can work in the opposite direction too, where you can say, hey, I have a minimum. I have a minimum. I'm going to write this policy 100 times. Right. And what's going to come at the end here? And this might be a little impractical, for a policy or something, but for a tagline, if you're going back into my world where you're working on an advertisement, if I have to do 3 options for somebody, okay, that's not too bad. If I have to do 100, well, what's going to happen is the first 3, the first 5, the first 20 are going to be, okay, I'm going to get all the normal stuff out of my system. But if I have to do 100 of them, well, okay, I'm going to get to the weird stuff now, right? I'm going to get to the stuff that is completely beyond my normal creative grooves.
So in those constraints, and I'm reminded of I forget the authors, the book, A Beautiful Constraint. Similarly, like the idea of high performers have the ability to self-impose constraints that force them into creative ways of thinking. And it feels like, of course, we have to have SOPs in our businesses and processes and workflows and things. Like how to make a cappuccino is not something we develop a tagline for, it's something we train,
Mhm.
right? At the same time, like when I walk people through writing values for their company that are actually operationally salient to their business, there's like a headline that says something like integrity or we believe in teamwork. And we can make it say something really that's meaningful in that short amount of time, but we have detail that means, well, now what does that mean in practice? But is it accurate for me to think that the way we craft our message of repetition, the communication, is I can use the simplicity principle to help people more thoroughly reflect on the details that we've already talked about in an SOP. Or if it's doing dishes, I want people to do dishes to a specific kind of way, but I also communicate to them excellence in the mundane. And to them, mundane means dishes. So I've created a simple message referring to maybe a complex task. Is that kind of a way we can marry complexity of operations to simplicity of communication?
Yes, I love what you just said there, excellence in the mundane. That reminds me of probably the most famous kind of mission statement that you've ever seen in the corporate world, which is Google, don't be evil, right? And they quietly abandoned this at some point, but it was don't be evil. That is so much more meaningful than in 3 words, and the same thing, excellence in the mundane, than a long sentence that says, "Well, we value, cooperation and integrity and diversity and innovation and all these other buzzwords." All of that kind of means nothing. There's a big difference between something that means something and something that looks pretty, right? This is the biggest crime that I see a lot in mission statements, in kind of value statements, and on outward facing stuff like websites and taglines, is that people like words that look pretty. They put these big fancy words like, again, like innovation and this and that. But in reality, that's not how people talk and that's not how we think. When you say excellence in the mundane, it's very easy to internalize that, saying we do the little things right. That's even if you even want to be kind of more kind of plain spoken about it, it ultimately meets us in the place that we are, instead of just kind of this broad platitude that we're supposed to somehow remember or think about.
Great point. Because we have different ways of speaking when we're addressing different audiences. We have the writing voice, we have our service voice. You've heard people do that when it's not how they talk to their friends, but that's how they talk to the person across the counter. So we're kind of used to code switching a little bit when it comes to our communication. And so we kind of fall into this, what we imagine, like, what would the 1980s manager sound like? And so I'm going to sound, I'm going to sound like that. And this actually comes up a little bit with some consulting in that somebody will say, "Hey, I'm having a problem with this employee." And I'll say, "Well, what's going on?" They describe it. They're like, "Well, they're doing X, Y, and Z, and I really feel that they should, or it's making this impact." And I say, "Well, everything you just said in the last 1 minute, you should just take that and tell them exactly that." It was like saying the answer to your question in stating the problem.
We're really good at talking, and we're not always so great at writing. So Seth Godin, who's a marketing author, he once wrote a little piece about this. Nobody ever gets talker's block. We get writer's block, and because we'll sit there and how do I word this thing, and what am I supposed to write and put here? Because we don't write as much. We only write once an email or two a day, maybe a blog post once every week or two. But we talk all the time, right? We might say thousands of words in a daily, tens of thousands of words on a daily basis. Our talking muscle is a lot stronger than our writing muscle. So if you have a hard time figuring out how to write that email or that employee evaluation, well, talk it out, right? Talk to yourself and record it. Talk to yourself in the mirror and just use the notes for it. Or go just talk to your colleague or your mentor or somebody else. How does it come out when you speak to them? And then take that language, turn around and use that as the basis for the thing you have to go write with that weaker writing muscle.
Now, the consequences that we imagine are at stake here is what might make us not want to do that because we think, "Yeah, well, that's a real casual way of treating something with a lot of gravity."
Yes and no. The gravity part of it, I think you respect that more when you actually connect with the audience instead of throwing a bunch of words out that don't mean anything. As a society, we use big words and complicated language when we want to hide stuff, right? If you look at the terms of use, the end user license agreements, all these things, they'll run thousands and thousands of words. The college reading level, if not graduate school reading level. They're designed to be dense. They're designed to hide stuff. But if you want to actually get something across, well, you want to use plain language. You want to meet somebody where they are. This reminded me of a story. Years ago, I was sitting at dinner with a few friends, and one of them worked at a company that was all over the news because of some really unfortunate product recall, and they were getting made fun of on late night shows and this and that. And so we sit down, and somebody asks them, "Well, how's it going over there?" And they say, "Well, it's unfortunate that these events occurred. However, da, 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 da." And we all just burst out laughing because you've never used the words "it's unfortunate" in your entire life in speaking. You've used it in an email, you've used it in an apology, you've used it in some press release, but no human has sat down with their best friends at dinner and said, "Well, it's unfortunate that that's not how humans speak." And it's something that comes from on high, from the PR people and the lawyers. They're saying this is how it's supposed to be.
Hmm.
But that's prioritizing the sender, not the receiver.
Well, we want to be professionals.
Oh, what does that mean, right? The like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I mean, the idea of a lot of our industry, my industry, like of coffee, for instance, there's better developed industries out there than specialty coffee retail. I mean, coffee shops have been around for a long time, but I do, and I have said this on the show before, that I feel that sometimes we suffer from an inferiority complex. And this could be just localized in the fact that you're just newly minted as a manager or an owner. And so you've got to prove yourself through adopting strange tools and behaviors and customs that mimic the behaviors of something that you imagine fits what you need to be for success in that role or in that industry. And it feels like that some of that's at play. That imposter syndrome creates the necessity for us to take on these modes of operation.
Oh, absolutely. So this is something that occurs all over the place. That reminded me a bit for a second about, I forget if it's from like an SNL bit or like a Reno 911 bit or Key and Peele or something. They were imitating a cop and they kept on using the word individual because that's just what every cop uses in all their reports. Is the individual was doing this, the individual was doing that. But again, that's not how people speak. If we want to seem really formal, we use individual instead of saying the person or the guy or whoever. But so there's a couple interesting pieces of research that I ran across in preparing this that touch on exactly what you were just saying. There was one study where they took graduate school application essays and they ran them through a process where they basically took all the words and they swapped them out for bigger, more complicated words. And then they had judges look at the two piles, separate judges, and they said, okay, well, grade the ones that are here that are the normal essays, and then grade the ones that have the bigger, fancier language in them. Across the board, what happened was the grades for the fancier language, the bigger words that we think would be smarter, well, those came back a lot lower than the grades for the plain language, the normal essays. And then this also worked the other way around, where they took the normal essays and they made them simpler and they used shorter words, they used easier language. And those performed even better than the ones that were the normal essays, and then obviously double so as opposed to the ones that are the fancier essays. This was kind of a giveaway here that oftentimes we try to put on the clothing of formality, of expertise, of fanciness, but what it does is actually kind of gives us away in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and maybe we are attracting to ourselves more people who resonate with disingenuous forms of communication that might shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to building an audience.
Oh, absolutely. Another version of this that was kind of an interesting giveaway. So in the US, there's like 150 or so international airports. And if you look at what they are, they're very different, right? Here in New York, there's JFK International Airport, the bajillion flights going in and out of it a day. I visited my grandmother once in Great Falls, Montana, and Great Falls, Montana has an international airport, which has a couple flights to Canada. So there's a big difference between the scale of these things. And so this one research team looked and they said, how do all these different airports refer to themselves in their own marketing material? And so they analyzed all their websites. And the large airports, how do they call themselves? They say JFK. Do they say JFK International, JFK International Airport? The large airports used the word international to describe themselves about 30% of the time. I don't have the number in front of me. It's about 30% of the time they used it. But these small airports, The ones that were like that Great Falls International Airport use the word international in their own references about 70% of the time, right? So it kind of was a giveaway that you're smaller, that you're kind of a lower status to use the language that implies maybe that you're the higher status. It's very interesting.
Oh, it is interesting. And so where we don't put our security in the abundance of words and fancy terminology and things, we use simplicity to communicate that, but we have to place our security in something else in order to, find some sense of peace and solid ground to move forward in business. Where do you find that people who use simplicity, you kind of redirect that energy that would have gone to overcomplication? Does it get redirected to just building a better foundation business wise, or engaging with customers? I mean, what's that downstream benefit of not wasting that energy?
Oh, I think it pays off in multitude in a lot of different ways. It helps organize you internally, both in your own head and on your own team. If something's complicated, something's out there, it's got a lot of little extra words, extra features, extra pages. It can be so multifaceted, you can kind of get lost in it. But when something is as simple as, you said kind of excellence in the mundane or don't be evil, when something is driving you that is that simple, it's really hard to kind of get lost in that. You understand, okay, what's the big fuzzy direction that we're going in? And that helps everybody kind of march to the same beat and go in the same direction. And also externally, I mean, it sells more stuff, right? Like the data is there. I mean, brands that communicate with simplicity as opposed to complication, they just sell more stuff. Some of the most effective advertising campaigns of all time, some of the most enduring brands, they all embrace simplicity and directness. And it ends up being something that pays dividends across the board.
I'm thinking a lot about in the world of supply chain transparency and coffee, and how a lot of what we do is we want to benefit people who are upstream in the work of coffee production. And so we do have this gravity about us that says we really need our customers to understand the sustainability issues, the social issues, the gravity of the fact that we're, this is that family. And so there's this ethic that we're trying to drive in our product. So it's purchasing the product, of course, but in a lot of coffee, it's more than purchasing. We really want people to grasp the why behind the purchase. I imagine simplicity also helps in that, but it also seems like because we have this social weight of responsibility in specialty coffee, that we could abandon simplicity in order to invite customers into quote unquote education, which ends up sometimes being this pile on of information that they don't know what to do with.
I think the last thing you just said there is kind of crucial to this, which is we every single day, all of us wake up caring about so many things. There's so many things that, our family, our friends, this deadline at work, our vacation coming up, did the Jets win? I mean, all these things take up time in our brain. We didn't wake up caring about seeing your next commercial. We didn't have on our to-do list, click on an Instagram ad. Nobody woke up saying, I can't wait to go to the coffee shop to learn about how the beans are sourced and what their sustainability practices are. But as a sender, those are things you do want to share oftentimes. So you have to respect the limited window that you get to grab anybody's attention and to really connect with them. Because again, the average American spends 13 hours a day consuming some form of media, looking at a screen, listening to the radio. 13 hours a day, that's basically everything, right? We are getting blasted with thousands and thousands of messages, advertising, warnings, those type of things that are just being sent to us, as well as the things that we're seeking out, like a book or an email or an article somewhere. There's thousands of things for us to pay attention to. As someone who's a sender, if you're the owner of a coffee shop, if you're an advertiser, you have to start with that humble position, which is that I have to assume that nobody cares. If I start with thinking everybody cares about everything I have to say, well, you're going to make all sorts of assumptions in the way you communicate that are going to make it so that nobody ever really listens to you. Nobody hears it. But if you start with the humility of saying, nobody cares, I have to connect to what matters to them, then you're going to be much more successful in all the domains which you communicate.
That is huge because ultimately the efficacy of our work, like, is it something that people can latch onto? That's what we're after, right? We want them to get it. And maybe we want them to get it too fast and we want them, to force it upon them. But by thinking about them first and connecting with what they already care about, it's the long game. So they're while at the same time we're talking about constraints of like get it done quickly to see how simple you could make it. Maybe there's also this patience that you have to have with being able to see the ROI, or getting maybe used to a different kind of key performance indicator in the work that you do. Is how big of a difference would you say there is between the KPIs that we use in our business when we use more complex systems versus simple ones?
When I talk about simplicity, so one of the principles is minimal, right? Is it everything you need, but only what you need? What we're optimizing for when we're optimizing for minimal communication, for fluent communication, is not the shortest set of characters, the not the least amount of letters or words or sentences or paragraphs or pages and so on and so forth. It is the least amount of friction. And sometimes that means more words. Sometimes that means more paragraphs, but it's about is the easiest for you to get from point A to point B. My background is in design. And if you put on the user experience design hat, that's what user experience designers are optimizing for. You've certainly seen this on the e-commerce side, where if you're buying something and you're checking out on Amazon or the Shopify site or somewhere else, well, what happens as soon as you put something in your cart? Well, everything else kind of falls off the page. It doesn't bring you into one giant form that has all the stuff on. It brings you into a step-by-step process that where you collect the address, you collect this credit card, you collect the shipping information, all these different pieces. But what's happening around the site at that time is that you're taking away all the stuff that's the blog, that's the about page, that's whatever, because those are all off ramps, right? If you're introducing friction, those are opportunities for people to search for an off ramp. If I'm showing someone just one screen on the checkout flow and it has all the stuff on it, well, that sometimes might feel a little more daunting than there being two or three screens in that checkout flow that are breaking things down to its atomic unit. So this is all just to say, as an example, sometimes more is less a little bit, to turn that phrase around, where it's easier for somebody to understand something if it does take a little bit more space to get it across.
I love it. The unique thing about coffee is that we are operating in the digital world, we're operating in the physical world. And internally, I think the communication that we have about all that's happening in these worlds makes that successful. I mean, the integrity of our businesses relies on us being on the same page. And so, all of this conversation that we've had about simplicity has many different places to land in how we kind of orchestrate our business from here on out. And I guess that's kind of my last question to you. If you put yourself in the position of somebody who is let's say they're a coffee shop owner and they do have an online sales element, they have a Instagram account, and they have employees and customers who come in for lattes every day. What do you feel are maybe the first two areas that they can start exercising some form of this kind of simplicity in the way they communicate?
Oh, well, so one thing I would throw out as a suggestion, and whenever I talk to somebody who is, if it's in the coffee, the quick serve, the restaurant space, I always say have a favorite. So what does that mean? Oftentimes, my wife gets tired of this sometimes, but we'll go to a restaurant somewhere, we're just traveling, and I get the menu, and I'm like, well, I asked the waiter, well, what's the best thing here? What's the thing I should get? And at that moment, I can tell if a place is good or not, because if it's a good place, they're going to say, well, you got to get this, you got to get that. This is the best thing. This is the best, don't get that piece. If the waiter comes to me and goes, well, okay, well, I don't know, they're all good. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. That didn't help narrow down my choices. We mentioned the paradox of choice earlier. All these options that I have mean that I'm giving up the other things that I'm not choosing. And so it's tough to make a choice on a big menu or something like that. If you have a favorite and you say, well, this is actually the best thing, and this is the most popular thing. If you like the chicken, it's this one or whatever. Or to pull it into the coffee shop space, if you say, well, this is the roast that's real, this is the best roast, or this is the one, if you like this, then this is the one you get. If you like this, then that's the one you get. All of a sudden, you made that an easier process for me. And that made it more fluent. And that made it something that I am more likely to like, to buy, and to enjoy. And so that, I think, is a very tangible takeaway, how to apply this to the coffee shop space, which is make sure that either you're referencing it on your menus or in your marketing somewhere, or at least your staff is trained in a way where when somebody says, well, what's good here, that you have a real answer to that.
Yeah, and it's so funny because you mentioned your wife. You said that she might get tired of it, and internally, I can tell you that sometimes staff are just like, "Ugh, there's the menu right there," because we don't have to go through the whole menu. But there is this embrace of the fact that the whole goal of us being there is to remove obstacles for enjoyment for the customer, and that's part of what hospitality is doing a lot of that heavy lifting for the customer, so that the simplicity of the experience is a feature of the experience. The same as making sure tables are clean, or the sign is visible, and the door actually opens when you pull on it, and the stuff like that. It feels like communication wise that fits right in with how we exercise hospitality. So let me just say again, thank you, Ben. We could talk a lot more about simplicity, but I feel like that would be overcomplicating it a little. But where can we get this book, simply put? And I think it would be great for everyone listening to this to get this and let it really impact their coffee shops. Where can we find this?
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, so we could certainly chat forever. There's a quote misattributed to Mark Twain, which is, I wrote you a long letter because I didn't have time to write you a short one. Right. So we could keep going. This has been a blast. I've had a ton of fun. If you want to grab Simply Put, you can search on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. You can find me at benguttmann.com. It's two T's and two N's, Guttmann. And there's links to the book and all the different places you can buy it there. There's also a free chapter if you're interested. You can download it on my website. And I send out an email every Tuesday. I post on LinkedIn all the time. So go connect with me on those channels as well.
Awesome. Thanks again, Ben. It was great talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks, Chris.
All right, everybody. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And one of the main things that I got from this time is that we need to be able to bear in mind who it is we're talking to and what will resonate with them, and almost take a leap of faith or trust that if we've done that thought exercise and we've teased out what the benefit is and the why behind what we're communicating enough, that simple message is going to do more work than we would have done with so many words. And that goes from how we communicate with our staff and getting buy-in for initiatives and managing change and things like that, as well as how we communicate the value of our products and the why behind what we sell, even down to the way that we want people to resonate with the social aspects and the ethics of what we do in our businesses. Simplicity is obviously something that we need to focus on and hone in our businesses. And this conversation, I hope, has given you some fuel to set you on that course in your business. So a huge thank you to Ben Guttmann for being on the show. If you're interested in learning more about the book, Simply Put, and what Ben is up to, you can go to the website benguttmann.com. And you can also follow Ben on LinkedIn, and that would be a great place to stay up to date with anything that he's involved with regarding his message of simplicity through his book, Simply Put. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about today's episode or any episode of Keys to the Shop, go ahead and email chris@keystotheshop.com. And chris@keystotheshop.com is also where you can reach out if you're interested in Keys to the Shop consulting and coaching. You want to work one-on-one with me to help you refine your business, your operations, people, and quality. Maybe you want to simplify in honor of today's episode. There's a lot we can talk about to bring your business into that transition in an effective way. And I would look forward to hearing from you, chris@keystotheshop.com. So with that is the end of our episode, everybody. I really appreciate you tuning in. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Follow on Instagram @KeysToTheShop, and share these episodes with people who you think will really benefit from the message. Have a great day, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.